To give you an indication of how much this backlash has worked, a survey in the Pork Network showed that 73% of the industry itself don't think these Ag-Gag laws are working. Now, they've only been used once, and that was in Utah. And a young woman named Amy Meyer found out about sick cows being moved around by bulldozers at a slaughterhouse. And she had heard that you could see it from the street. And so she did what I think any of us would do. I constantly have my phone, I know we all do. She just recorded it. And she was from the public street. You could barely see it off on the side there. And remember what I said about those sick cows leading to the meat recall. She had every reason to think this was an important thing that needed to be documented. Well, the slaughterhouse didn't like that very much. And she was prosecuted for violating the Ag-Gag law for filming from the public sidewalk. I found out about this case and wrote about it. And the story caught on really fast, incredibly fast. And within 24 hours, the prosecutor just said, forget it, we're going to drop all charges. To me, I think that says a lot about not just how this industry is terrified about exposing what actually happens every day on factory farms, but how they're terrified of the general public becoming aware of this disproportionate response, this crackdown on people who are just filming abuse. The same thing happened again a couple weeks ago. This is Taylor Raddick. She worked as an investigator, filming how dairy calves were being beaten, just horrific abuses. She was called into the sheriff's office in Colorado, and they said, Taylor, did you film this? And she had her attorney there, and she said, yeah. They're like, well, we want to bring charges against the people that were involved in these beatings and this abuse. She said, I'm happy to help. I said, can you verify this was your footage? And she said, yeah. Can you say that you saw this and you saw these people, you were there seeing this? And she said, yeah. And they said, okay, well, come over here, we're going to take your mugshot. You're going to be prosecuted for animal cruelty. A woman who filmed the abuse, to stop the abuse, and then turned it over to police, was prosecuted for animal cruelty. It was the same type of situation where once the public attention got out there, eventually these charges were dropped. But these groups aren't being deterred by that. When I was talking before about how everyone is at risk by this type of legislation, the latest Ag-Gag bills of last year that were introduced, one was in North Carolina, it doesn't even mention factory farms. It doesn't talk about photography. It talks about anyone who exposes what any industry is doing against their will can be prosecuted. Now, this is the attempt by the ag industry to step back and pretend that this isn't an Ag-Gag law because that term is just toxic right now. But as a result, you have this legislation being introduced that applies to everything. Do you protest fracking? That's wrapped up in this. Do you protest automobile companies for unsafe worker practices? That's wrapped up in this. Do you protest Monsanto because of genetic engineering? That's targeted in this. This language is so broad. It lists all of these different industries. Now it's spreading to other countries as well. This is something that I've been really fortunate to do a lot of international traveling talking about the book. And I felt really naive. I didn't really understand the scope to which this is spread. Now you have Europol, which is the International Police Agency in Europe, sending out terrorism reports in which they're talking about photography. They're saying the terrorism threat through all of Europe is animal activists taking photos which they call disinformation methods, images of sick and abused animals. I was down in Australia and New Zealand for a speaking tour this summer, and come to find out that Australian industry had just introduced language, promised to introduce language, I don't think they've done it yet, that's saying, well, we see all this stuff going on in the States, and we think we should have the same protections that the industry does there. We think we should have our own Ag-Gag laws. So they're doing that copying and pasting between countries. And the reason I think that's so important is because what's happening here in Tennessee matters. It matters in a scale that I don't think any of us are really comprehending right now. The industry globally, the movement globally, is all facing the same challenges. The changes we're seeing in this dialogue about the animals and environment and workers' rights, that dialogue is changing around the world. I think these are some of the defining issues of our times, and these corporations in other countries want to take those same tactics and just plop them down in other countries. So if we allow that to happen here, it makes it that much easier for it to happen elsewhere. I think part of the way we fight back is I'm involved in a lawsuit right now in Utah as a journalist saying that this work puts me at risk. It puts my sources at risk. The other people involved are animal protection groups, professors, undercover investigators. So as we're talking about these issues, we need to remember that this is a lot bigger than any particular state battle. Now there's a group that's been formed here locally that you all can plug into, and I hope you do, because this bill in Tennessee is probably going to be dropped any day now, if not any week. It might be different than the one last year. I expect it's going to be a little bit different because that was vetoed by the governor, and a huge victory. But this stuff isn't going away. And frankly, after Ag-Gag is done, because I think it will be in a year or two, there's going to be another one. And I say that not to kind of suck the wind out of the room here, but to emphasize that the reason this stuff is happening is not specifically because of the investigator or Taylor or Amy Meyer or any of you all. It's happening because these tactics have been incredibly effective at challenging business as usual. So whatever your tactics are, if they are effective, you're going to face consequences like that. And I emphasize this because I think we need to reshift, change a little bit how we think about this kind of backlash and oppression. It's not something that you can try to like tiptoe around and we'll think, well, if I do this, this, and this, how do I avoid the wrath of industry? I think you should be strategic and thoughtful and ask yourselves those questions, but at the end of the day, remember that this is happening because these movements are redefining all of these issues. They're changing the discussion. They're threatening business as usual. It's no longer about whether these underground groups are breaking windows. They're creating them. They're showing what's really happening in these places. For animals, for 9 billion animals every year, for the workers that have no choice but to be in horrific environments, and for the toxic consequences this is having and how it relates to climate change. All of that stuff is related. And on top of that, your health. I mean, that's something I don't really talk about a lot of these discussions, but I mean, for those of you here who are not vegetarian or vegan or don't consider yourselves animal rights people, I would argue in a lot of ways you have a much more personal stake in these issues, literally, because this is what you're buying, this is what you're consuming, this is what you're feeding to your family. And there's other discussions that can be had about whether or not we should do that, but if you are, don't you have the right to know where that's coming from? Don't you have the right to know whether that's safe? Whether it's a good idea to feed that to your kids? The threat that we're talking about isn't about radical groups. It's about all of us. It's about you all having the right to know, and whether you have the ability or should be trusted with the ability to have information and make educated decisions. So in that spirit, thank you all for being that educated threat. And thank you all, Bruce Junction, for having me out here.